Hello number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today we're talking about the top 10 most effective Roman weapons, although I'm not just going to talk about the weapons that the Romans made, but also any sort of weapons that the Romans utilized during battle and war. If you are yet not members of this community, please become a number one and subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron. When you think of the Roman army, you mostly imagine hand-to-hand combat and heavy infantry, but it was a lot more complex than that. The Romans adapted to any strategical and tactical situation, and they did use auxiliaries, which means mercenaries. Now, some of these mercenaries are the slingers, recruited directly from the Balearic Islands. Of course, the idea of a sling is not that complicated. You take a stone, you put it in a pouch, you swing it, and you hit someone, possibly who's not too far away from you. But accuracy required training. Not anyone can do that and be effective from a military point of view. So can a stone thrown with a sling in the classical period kill a man? Well, the answer is yes. Of course, if the man was wearing a helmet, it would be harder to do that. But if you hit someone who is not wearing a helmet, and keep in mind a lot of Roman enemies didn't, yes, you can one-shot a man. Now, as we look at the Trajan column, we see that sometimes slingers are represented also carrying shields. That is debated. We don't know if that's something they actually did or not. But regardless of the details, we do know that the Romans considered them to be an effective unit to deploy. Now, before moving to the next weapon, I'd like to mention the sponsor that made this video possible, namely Raid Shadow Legends. Download Raid now for mobile or PC using my link in the description below. Alright, so Raid is an RPG turn-based game. It has PvE features, PvP features. Probably the best thing about this game, in my opinion, are the champions, because there are so many highly detailed, very characterized, typical fantasy champions. You can get the Orc Warrior, you can get the Elven Archer, you can get the tank in full play. You know, depending on your own play style, you choose a certain amount of champions and then you try and put them together. They clearly level up. There are typical RPG features. And another good point of this game is the fact that the controls work really well, because they are simple enough to work very well both on your phone and on your desktop, obviously. There are lots of different kinds of battle: clan boss, arena, campaign, dungeons, each of these providing different experiences and different rewards. Also, my in-game name is Metatron YT, which stands of course for YouTube. Find me, attack me, fight me, take me on. I'll be waiting for you. There are a lot of different possible tournaments: Spider's Den, Ice Golem's Peak, the Almighty Fire Knight, and the Notorious Dragon. Patch 1.15 is coming in May, and with it you'll be able to compete in the brand new arena tournament, earn points according to your tier, and win awesome rewards in the local and global tournament. So if you're into fantasy and you're looking for a new game to play, go into the description, click the special link there, and if you're a new player, you'll get 100,000 silver and a free champion, Grumbler. These special rewards will be available only for the next 30 days from now. And to be honest, Grumbler is actually a pretty good champion for new players. New players will find all of the rewards in their inbox in the game, which is found right here on the top right corner. Big thanks again to Raid Shadow Legends for supporting my content and my channel. They supported me, so let's support them back. Let's check them out, check their game out, and of course the link in the description below. The Plumbatae were lead-weighted darts, handheld and hand-thrown, that were used by armies in the antiquity. Usually when you think of the Plumbatae, you imagine the late Roman army. And rightly so, and I could say even the Byzantine army, and that is because that's very famous. It's a very famous imagery, and they were used and mentioned. But also the Greeks used them, so it was a kind of weapon that was not only Roman, which is important to underline. Vegetius in De Re Militari mentioned this weapon and praises it. He tells us that every soldier carries 5 of these small javelins in a hollow of his shield, for they wound both the men and horses of the enemy before they come within reach of the common missile weapons. Another mention of the Plumbata we have in De Rebus Bellicis, and what is interesting about this is that it's the only actual iconographic image that shows us what it would have looked like. And it basically is, the way we have to imagine it, is a sort of an in-between between a full javelin and a handheld arrow, with the addition of a weight. Now, whenever we think of the crossbow, we usually think of the late medieval version, the medieval in general version, for example, that used by the famous Genoese crossbowmen, which was, of course, a very different weapon to the sort of weapon that I'm going to describe now. But the Romans did have a sort of weapon which resembles the crossbow very much. Now, usually these would be siege weapons, such as the Scorpio and the Ballista, but we do have mentions of the so-called Manu Ballista, so a sort of handheld version of the ballista, which basically was a big crossbow. Now, there is a lot of controversy as to how these weapons were used and how effective they would be. The general idea is that a field version existed, which was a smaller version of the actual ballista, but it was used by at least 2 men, and again, it was a sort of weapon used during sieges. We do have stone carvings and pictorial evidence of small handheld crossbow-like weapons used by people during the Roman Empire, but the majority of this imagery comes from hunting scenarios. So yes, something that looked similar to a handheld crossbow existed, but it wasn't used, as far as we know, for military purposes. And the military version would be something akin to a sort of siege weapon. The bow and arrow is an ancient weapon. When I say ancient, I mean that it goes all the way back to prehistorical times, to the Mesolithic period, where we know that hunters and gatherers were using them as hunting tools. Now, we are not 100% sure when it started to be used in warfare, in battle, but we do know that the Romans did use archers. In Latin, the bow was called arcus and the arrow was called sagitta, which is interesting because an archer will be a Sagittarius, which is basically the exact same word as the zodiac sign. So how essential and important were Sagittari for the Roman army? Because we do know that archers will become very, very powerful and effective in the Middle Ages. Say the Mary Rose bow used by the famous English longbowmen, and the sort of damage and wounds and kills and casualties that those weapons could cause. But you shouldn't imagine classical bows to be as effective as medieval bows, and therefore archers for the Roman armies were mercenaries. They didn't train citizen troops to be archers. They would pay people coming from other places. Most famous would be archers from Crete, but there were also others. They would pay them and as auxilia, so mercenaries. And one of the main differences between mercenaries and citizen soldiers, like the heavy infantry, was the fact that Rome wouldn't supply these troops with weapons and armor. They would have to carry their own. Usually they didn't carry much armor, but they did provide, of course, they did come with their bows and their weapons and their munition. They would just provide them with, of course, a pay and food. So the arcus is still an effective weapon. They used it, particularly during sieges and sometimes also during open field battles. But in the classical period, it wasn't as effective of a weapon as close quarter weapons were in conjunction with armor. So yes, it does make the list. It definitely was important, but we do need to keep in mind that they would have a different role within the armies of the time. So the pugio is basically a short, strong, tough, sturdy, very pointy, and of course thrust-oriented dagger. It acts as a backup weapon in case you lose your main weapon. And as a soldier, although you are trained, and of course you know how to use your main weapons, and maybe you will go through an entire battle without dropping your weapon or being disarmed, you never know. And therefore, for these situations, you would carry a pugio. A pugio would also be something that you always have on you. So maybe you are not carrying your actual main battlefield weapon at the moment, in a specific moment, whether you're in a camp, but you will always be carrying your pugio if you own one. As you look through the scope of Roman history, the idea of uniformity is more of a Hollywood situation. Not all Romans wore the same armor, not all Romans could afford the same quality of weapons and armor. It would be a very useful weapon to quickly finish off and subdue an enemy before you move on to your next opponent. So at number 5 we have the hasta, if you want to pronounce it in classical Latin, or just asta if you want to say it in ecclesiastical Latin. This is the spear. And you know, if you are a subscriber to my channel, that usually in my lists the spear is like one of the top, if not the top. It kind of depends. But generally speaking, the spear I consider the spear to be one of the most effective weapons that mankind has ever come up with. So why am I not putting the hasta at number 1 in this list? Well, the reason is that we're looking at the Roman way of war. And the Romans, yes, they did use hastae. So they did use spears for their army. But we do know that they eventually will sort of abandon them in a way. Let's expand a little bit on. Before the Marian reforms, before the imperial times and the sort of heavy infantry professional soldier that we usually have in mind when we think of the Roman army, we know that we had manipular legions. Manipular legions were divided into different kinds of soldiers. You would have the hastati, who were originally in the early republic the spearmen, because that's where the name comes from. They are carrying the hastae. Then you would have the principes and the triarii, who were the veteran soldiers, the better armor, the richest soldiers as well. The Roman army in the early republic, although we don't know much, we do know that it probably would have looked a lot like Greek armies. So the phalanx. And it is believed that not only hastati, but also principes and triarii carried hastae. So they did have spears. Everyone had a spear. But things change, and eventually the hastati, they keep their name, but as we move into the late Republican Manipular Legion, if you imagine Second Punic War, by this time both the hastati and the principes abandon the spear and switch to sword and shield. We do know that triarii, all the way up to the actual Marian reforms, are the only ones that kept the spears. And then during the Marian reforms, the Romans decide to just get rid of them and equip them mostly with swords. However, one of the most accredited reasons as to why the Romans take away the spears from their soldiers, changing them into swordsmen, is because they give them javelins instead. And if you think about it, a javelin, it's basically a throwing optimized spear. It still is a spear, so it's not that the Romans don't use spears anymore, but they choose to throw them. And clearly if you throw your spear, then you need to use your other weapon for close combat, which you can because of the shield, and I'll talk more about that later. If someone asks why are they called hastati even though they don't have the spear, it's because originally they did. Why did they renounce the spear in favor of swords? It's because they actually don't. They just choose to change them in shape and throw them. Now, the spatha is clearly the precursor to the medieval swords that are all longer than the usual classical swords. And I don't want to really say just Roman, but even Greek swords and Egyptian swords and Celtic swords, they tend to be shorter, and when we look at the classical period, than their counterparts in the medieval times. Now, the reason for this is not only a tactical choice, because of course the idea of the Roman using a very big shield allowed them to get closer, and that would be very similar for the Greeks as well. So usually if you have a very big shield, you can afford to get closer, and therefore at very close range you don't really want to wield a sword that is too long in that situation. It's a very different kind of combat. It's a very different kind of warfare to the medieval sort of warfare. But another thing is that one of the reasons why the Romans or classical civilizations didn't use very long swords is because you need to be really good at metallurgy and have access to really good metal to be able to make weapons that are long and don't break. And in fact, this is also one of the reasons why bronze weapons, like bronze swords, don't really get very long, because again, if you make it too long, it will break more easily. But as metallurgy gets better in the medieval period, the steel used to produce these swords becomes better, and therefore they can afford longer swords that grant them a higher reach. Now, in the late Roman period, we do know that they will eventually switch to the spatha, which is longer. One of the reasons that they did that is because the kind of tactics, the kind of warfare that the Romans were doing was now different. And also, the Romans started more and more to utilize cavalry and mounted troops. When you are mounted, then a longer sword is usually a better option. It allows you to reach your target more easily than a short sword would. So it's a different kind of warfare, of course, and if you were a mounted kind of soldier, then probably a spatha would be a better idea than some of the weapons that would be higher on the list here. But since we're talking about the general and sort of classic way of war of the Romans, then the spatha is here for now. The pilum is the throwing javelin used by the Roman army. We don't know if they carried one, we don't know if they carried two. There is speculation on this, probably changed. I would imagine that again, since uniformity is not always the case, it probably also varied if the general, although I shouldn't really call him a general, the legatus, if the legatus decided, hey, for this battle I want you to carry two, soldiers would have done it. That doesn't automatically mean that every single legion in the entirety of the scope of Roman Empire and Republic did that. But regardless of the number, we know that the Romans used optimized javelin, the pila, and they would throw them at the enemy up to a reasonable distance, definitely better than other weapons such as slings or plumbatae, dealing a lot of damage. There is a lot to say on the pila. My friend Matt Easton has been making a lot of interesting content on the pilum and pila in general, so if you haven't checked it out, I'll leave links in the description below. But the idea is that a pilum can be used to kill, it can be used to wound, it can be used to reduce the morale of your enemy, to create confusion and chaos, particularly if they are not well-trained soldiers. It is often mentioned that the pilum also had the ability to render your opponent's shield useless. True, it can happen, although I would consider it a secondary ability, because the main thing of the pilum is to penetrate the shield and penetrate the soldier and possibly get rid of him. Not necessarily kill him, but if you wound a soldier badly enough, he will be out of combat, and that's basically all what it was. Strangely enough, I decided to put the scutum among the Roman weapons because scutum is such a central weapon, defensive weapon. The scutum has such a pivotal role in the efficacy of the Roman army, but also in their choice of weapons, that I think it really deserves not only a spot, but a very high one at that. The scutum itself evolves through the ages. Generally speaking, the word scutum, although now in the modern times when we say scutum, we imagine the rectangular typical Roman shield, but then again, scutum just means shield for a Roman. There were many different kinds of scuta throughout history, but the rectangular kind of imperial shield is definitely the one that I think is the most optimized, at least for infantry combat. It wraps around you, it protects you, it works spectacularly in a unit, it allows you to create very, very effective shield walls and at the same time to create the testudo. Now the scutum, just like anything else, can also be used to attack. It's center bossed, so it's rather easy to punch with it, but you can also lift it and hit someone in the teeth and break their teeth. There are a lot of maneuvers that you can do with the scutum. It is somewhat heavy, but with training, a good Roman soldier could use the scutum extremely effective. And in my experience, as both as a reenactor, but also as someone who likes training with his friends, I noticed that when you fight someone carrying a scutum, it is extremely difficult to find a way to get through their line of defense, because the scutum really protects most of your body. It stays there, it protects you, keeps you safe, and it allows you to close in and use weapons that otherwise wouldn't have been as effective. We know that a Roman scutum would be made of several layers, usually between 2 to 3, and they would be made of plywood, so which I know it can be strange for some people to think. Of course, ancient plywood wouldn't be exactly the same as modern plywood, but the Romans did have access to plywood, and they would use a whole variety of different kinds of trees. There are some trees that are considered to be better to make scuta, but at the end of the day, what the Romans did was, depending on where we are, we will use the sort of wood that we find in abundance. And another thing that the Roman did was to create a rim of metal all around the shield. And this was used for two reasons. One, it was because that way it would be harder for you to split the wood of the scutum, because you would first have to cut through the metal rim. And secondly, it also helps particularly for the bottom of the shield, because every single time that you put the shield down, and as a reenactor I can tell you that that's exactly how it is, every single time you put the shield down, if you only have wood and you hit a rock or the ground is particularly tough and grainy, then you could ruin the edge of your shield, and you don't want that. But with the metal reinforcement, you can literally smash it on the floor anytime you want, and it's not going to be a problem, so it increases durability. Now, from a Roman perspective, the Gladius Hispaniensis is king, and that is why it's here as number 1 on this list. The Romans made this weapon extremely effective. And the way they did this is because they paired it up with the scutum. Now, if you gave me this on its own and put me against someone with a longer weapon, I would be most likely in trouble. But if you give this to me paired together with a big shield, then the situation changes completely. In fact, you can make this to be a pain in the neck to deal with even for an opponent who's got more reach than you, because the moment you close in, and you can, because you're a Roman and you have full armor and the helmet and the shield, then it's going to be problematic to operate a weapon that is meant for longer reach while the Romans start stabbing like crazy very quickly. Also because, again, a stab is very difficult to defend from. So in the hands of a trained Roman, the gladius becomes the most effective weapon. And we see that although the Romans are kind of the exception that used gladi, so swords, as their main weapons, they did make it work. And if they kept doing that for hundreds of years, that itself is a proof that the sword was extremely effective within the Roman military way. When we look at actual archaeological evidence, we see that Roman gladi were made in an exceptionally good way. And even all the way back to Etruscan swords, we see that, first of all, they tend to be steel. Even though this may sound strange or counterintuitive to people who consider steel to be a more modern thing, steel is not modern at all. Mass production of steel is relatively modern. But in the medieval period, medieval smiths could already make extremely good quality steel. Not as good quality as what we have today, but metallurgy in the Middle Ages was quite advanced. And even in Roman times, we know that Etruscan swords and Roman swords tend to be steel. Low carbon steel, and obviously not homogeneous. Not even medieval steel was homogeneous in the quantity of carbon, but it was steel, and particularly a kind of steel or iron ore that then will be turned into steel. So the alloy that the Romans were particularly proud of was the steel from the region Noricum, which will become, in imperial times, part of the Roman Empire. So because of all these reasons, the gladius takes number 1 on my list. Alright, noble ones, well, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember thumbs up, and if you're yet not members of this community, become a noble one. Subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron, and don't forget to check out the link in the description below and try Raid Shadow Legends. If you do that, again, you will be supporting my channel, so thank you so much. And remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.